The bread was still warm. Dexter Keene stood on the porch of the house that no longer felt like his own, staring down at the cloth-wrapped loaf sitting on the top step like a small, impossible miracle. The morning sun had not yet cleared the ridge above Caldwell, Kansas, and the air carried the bite of early November 1882, sharp enough to sting his eyes. Or maybe that was something else entirely. He could not be sure anymore. He had not been sure of anything in the 11 days since they had lowered his wife into the frozen ground of the Caldwell Cemetery, while the preacher's words fell on him like stones he could not carry. His hands, rough from 15 years of ranching and fence-mending and drought-fighting, shook as he reached down and picked up the loaf. The cloth was plain muslin, tied with a piece of twine at the top, and when he pressed it against his chest out of pure instinct, out of some broken animal need for warmth, something cracked open inside him that he had spent 11 days hammering shut. He had not cried at the funeral. He had not cried when the neighbors came with their casseroles and their condolences, and their carefully averted eyes that told him they had all known, on some level, that Clara had been failing for months. He had not cried when he buried her wedding ring in the small cedar box she kept her hairpins in, because he could not look at it. He had not cried when his ranch hand Eli had quietly packed his own things and ridden south because a grieving man with no money coming in and no words to offer was not a man worth working for. But he cried now. Standing alone on the porch of the house where Clara had hung her curtains and baked her apple tarts and hummed hymns he could not remember the names of, Dexter Keene pressed a loaf of bread to his chest and wept like he was 18 years old, and the world had just shown him for the first time exactly what it was capable of taking from a person. He wept for a long time. When he finally stopped, when the shaking in his shoulders quieted and his breath came back in slow, jagged pulls, he looked out across the gray Kansas morning and asked himself one question. Who had left it? He had not seen anyone, had not heard boots on the porch steps, had not noticed a horse at the gate. Whoever had done this had come quietly and left quietly, the way people only move when they don't want credit for their kindness. That in itself told him something. Most people in Caldwell gave their charity loudly, with their heads held at a particular angle that required you to feel grateful in the exact degree they prescribed. This person had not waited for his gratitude, had not knocked, had simply left something warm at his door and walked away. He looked at the bread again. It was a good loaf, dense and golden, with a slightly cracked crust that told him it had been baked in a Dutch oven with a good fire behind it, not in one of those newfangled cast iron ranges that the more prosperous women in town had started importing from the catalogs out of St. Louis. This was frontier bread, simple, real, made by someone who knew what they were doing and had been doing it a long time. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table he had not cleared since the night before Clara died, when he had set 2 plates without thinking, and he broke off a piece of the bread and ate it. It tasted like something he had almost forgotten. Warmth, care, the specific gravity of being thought about by another human being. He finished half the loaf before he stopped, and then he folded the cloth back over what remained and set it on the table like it deserved to be there. It was 3 more days before he learned who had left it. Maude Walker had lived at the edge of Caldwell's South Quarter for 2 years. In the small house her late uncle had left her in his will, along with a modest piece of land that ran along Bluff Creek and produced enough to keep her independent but not enough to make anyone jealous. She was 28 years old. She had come to Caldwell from Wichita in 1880 after the man she had been promised to had decided at the last moment that a woman without family connections was a liability he could not afford, and she had arrived in this town with a packed trunk, a sharp mind, and the particular kind of quiet dignity that comes from having been underestimated so many times that the practice of being underestimated has become almost comfortable. She had known Clara Keene only slightly. They had spoken at church on perhaps a dozen occasions. Clara had been a gentle woman with kind eyes and a persistent cough that everyone in town had been pretending for 2 years was nothing serious. Maude had brought food to other families in hard times before. It was not a remarkable thing she did. It was simply what you did in a town like Caldwell when someone was hurting, and you had flour and salt and a working oven. But she had known, even as she walked in the dark that November morning with the warm loaf wrapped in her hands, that something about this particular act of kindness felt different. She had stood at the bottom of Dexter Keene's porch steps for a long moment before she climbed them. Long enough to see the light burning inside at 4 in the morning, the particular amber glow of a man sitting somewhere in his house, not sleeping, not reading, just sitting in the company of a grief so large it required a lamp to keep at bay. She had climbed the steps, set the bread down, and walked back to her horse as quickly and quietly as she could. She had not expected to think about him again. She thought about him the entire 3-mile ride home. Maude had a reputation in Caldwell that she had not entirely chosen but had decided to inhabit honestly. She was the woman who baked for the sick, who brought medicine when Doc Albright was out of town, which was frequently, who kept a vegetable garden that was frankly too large for one person, and who consequently always had something to press into a neighbor's hands. The women of Caldwell liked her in the way that comfortable people like someone who asks for nothing and gives reliably. The men of Caldwell had a more complicated relationship with Maude Walker, because she had refused 3 proposals in 2 years, and she did not look sorry about any of them. The truth of those refusals was simpler than the gossip suggested. Each of those men had been looking for something she recognized from painful experience: a woman to manage, a practical arrangement disguised as affection, a solution to the problem of running a household without having to understand another person's interior life. She had looked at each of those men carefully and seen no curiosity in their eyes when they looked at her, no genuine wondering about who she was, only calculation. She was not interested in being calculated. She heard about the bread through a chain of events that had nothing to do with Dexter Keene himself. His neighbor Mrs. Opal Harmon, who was 63 and missed nothing, had apparently seen a figure moving in the pre-dawn dark and mentioned it at the dry goods store to Betsy Kroll, who had asked around and eventually arrived at the logical conclusion that it had been Maude Walker, because who else in this town baked at 4 in the morning and gave it away anonymously? That was how Sheriff Dale Prout ended up stopping Maude's wagon on the road south of town on a Wednesday afternoon, not out of any official business, but purely because he was the kind of man who collected information the way other men collected land. "Heard you paid a visit to the Keene property," Prout said, pulling his horse alongside her wagon without asking her to stop, which forced her to slow her horse herself. Maude looked at him with the expression she had perfected for dealing with men who presumed, calm, politely blank. "I left food on a neighbor's porch. That's not a visit, Sheriff. Dexter Keene's not exactly your neighbor. You live half a mile south of his property line." "Grief doesn't require proximity," Maude said. "Are you here to tell me there's a law against leaving bread on a porch?" Prout had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. He was not a bad man exactly. Just a man who had confused access to power with a right to other people's business. "No law against it," he said. "Just making conversation." "Then I'll say good day," Maude said, and clucked her horse forward. She heard him call after her, something about how Keene was not the kind of man who accepted charity well, a warning perhaps or something meant to sound like advice, and she filed it away without responding. That evening she was rereading a letter from her sister in Wichita when she heard horses on the road and then, unmistakably, a knock at her door. She was not expecting anyone. She set down the letter, straightened her dress out of pure habit, and opened the door. Dexter Keene stood on her porch. He was taller than she had fully registered at church, where she had mostly seen him from across the room standing next to Clara, whose presence somehow made everything near her smaller. Without that context, he was just himself. 6 feet of weathered Kansan with dark hair gone slightly gray at the temples, wearing a coat that had seen better years, and holding his hat in both hands with the white-knuckled grip of a man who had rehearsed exactly what he planned to say and was now discovering that none of it applied. His eyes were red-rimmed. Not from crying currently, she thought. From the residual evidence of crying recently. There was something raw and almost terrified in his expression, and she understood immediately that this was a man who did not do this, did not knock on women's doors, did not show up unannounced, did not make himself vulnerable to being seen. "You're the one who left the bread," he said. It was not a question. "I am," Maude said. He stood there for a moment that stretched long enough to make her wonder if she should say something else, and then he said, quietly and with great precision, like a man reading from a document he had written in a moment of dangerous sincerity, "I want you to know that it helped." "I'm glad," she said. Another silence. The November wind moved between them. "I'm Dexter Keene," he said, which she found, against all expectation, almost unbearably touching given that she had been aware of his name for 2 years. He was introducing himself because he did not know how else to close the distance he had just crossed, and he was trying to do it right. "I know," she said gently. "I'm Maude Walker." "I know," he said. And then he stood there in the cold on her porch, holding his hat, and she understood that whatever he had planned to say after the bread acknowledgement had failed him completely. He had knocked on a stranger's door because a loaf of bread had undone him, and he did not know what to do with being undone. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression she would later describe to herself as a man measuring the distance between one world and the next. "I don't want to impose," he said. "You wouldn't be," she said. "I just made it." He came in. He sat at her kitchen table, which was cleaner than his but not pretentious about it, and she poured him coffee and watched him wrap both hands around the cup like the warmth was something he had been rationing. She sat across from him and did not say anything right away, because she had learned over the years that grief requires room, and that most people make the mistake of trying to fill it with noise. "She was sick a long time," he said eventually, not looking at her but at the middle distance above his cup. "I know," Maude said. "I noticed. People keep telling me it's a mercy, that she's not suffering." His jaw tightened. "I know it's supposed to be comfort. I can't make it feel like comfort." "You don't have to," Maude said. "Not yet." He looked at her then, really looked at her. She held his gaze steadily because she had nothing to hide and no performance to maintain, and she thought he deserved to be looked back at honestly. "The bread," he said. "Why'd you do it anonymously?" "Because you needed the bread more than you needed to owe someone," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then that's the most sensible thing anyone said to me in 11 days. Grief makes people say a lot of nonsense," she agreed. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not yet. The muscles of his mouth were not ready for that. But something around his eyes loosened slightly, like a knot worked at for a long time finally giving a fraction of an inch. They talked for 2 hours. Not about anything particularly significant, in the way that the most significant conversations rarely are about significant things on the surface. He asked about her garden. She asked about the ranch. He told her that he had 12 head of cattle and approximately 4 acres of winter wheat, and that he had no ranch hand since Eli had left, and he was managing it alone. She told him that she had 30 chickens and a mule named Absalom, who had the worst temperament of any animal she had ever encountered, but who pulled a plow with remarkable commitment. He laughed at the mule story. Not a large laugh. Small and brief and slightly surprised at itself. The laugh of a man who had forgotten he was capable of the sound. But it was real, and she noted it carefully without making a fuss over it. When he stood to leave, he put his hat back on and looked around her kitchen with the expression of a man noting that a room feels lived in the right way, warm and practical and honest, and he said, "I'm sorry I came out here without warning." "Don't apologize," Maude said. "I'm glad you did." He nodded, clearly still in the process of organizing his own feelings, and walked out to his horse. She watched him ride down the road until the dark swallowed him up, and then she stood in her doorway a moment longer than was strictly necessary before closing it. She told herself it was only kindness. She was already in the process of understanding that she was lying to herself. The second time Dexter Keene came to Maude Walker's door, he had a purpose, which was both better and more complicated than the first time, when he had come purely on instinct and emotion. It was a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after the coffee, and he was carrying the muslin cloth and twine that had been wrapped around the bread. "I wanted to return this," he said. "Cleaned it." Maude looked at the folded cloth, ironed smooth and neatly tied, and felt something she was not prepared to identify tucked behind her sternum. "You didn't have to iron it," she said. "I know," he said. "I had time." This was, she understood, a man who had pressed another woman's curtains and another woman's tablecloths for 15 years and who had ironed a piece of muslin at 5 in the morning because his hands needed something to do and because it was a way of being careful with something that belonged to her. "Would you like to walk?" she asked. "The creek's not frozen yet. It's a nice morning." He paused for only a moment. "I'd like that," he said. They walked along Bluff Creek for almost an hour. The cottonwoods were bare, and the water ran cold and brown, and the grassland around them lay flat and amber under the pale November sky. He told her about coming to Kansas in 1868 from Kentucky, following a promise of land that had turned out to be real, which he said had surprised him, because he had been promised many things by that point in his life that had turned out not to be. She asked about his family. He told her carefully, in the manner of someone handling something that was still tender, about a father who had been a hard man in the specific way that the post-Civil War border country produced hard men, about learning early that showing feeling was a kind of weakness that invited cruelty, about unlearning that lesson slowly and imperfectly over many years. "Clara used to say I carried my feelings around in a locked box," he said. "She wasn't wrong. She was patient about it, more patient than she probably should have been." "She sounds like she was a good woman," Maude said. "She was," he said simply. "She was." They walked a little further in silence, and then he said, "You're easy to talk to. I don't mean that as an insult." "I didn't take it as one," Maude said. "I just mean I don't usually." He stopped, looked at the water. "I don't usually say things." "You're doing a fairly impressive job of it today," she said. He looked at her sideways, and this time the thing around his eyes was definitely something warmer than the knot loosening of 2 weeks ago. "Are you always like this?" "Like what?" Maude asked. "Direct," he said, "but not unkind about it." "I try," she said. "Life's too short for being indirect, and I've got no interest in being cruel." He considered this with the seriousness he apparently brought to most things she said, which she was beginning to find unexpectedly affecting. Men had told her she was pretty, which she received with mild indifference. Men had told her she was capable, which she had earned and knew it. No man she could immediately recall had ever listened to her the way Dexter Keene listened, like she was saying something he had been trying to work out for a long time, and was grateful to finally hear said plainly. She caught herself noticing things she had no particular business noticing. The way the cold air had put color in his face that made him look less gray than he had that first night on her porch. The steadiness of his hands when he pointed out a pair of mergansers on the creek. The fact that he walked beside her rather than slightly ahead, which was not as universal a courtesy as it ought to have been among the men of Caldwell. She was going to have to be honest with herself about this sooner rather than later, she thought. But not yet. Not today. When they returned to her house, he thanked her for the walk with a formal sincerity that made her want to smile, and he rode home, and she stood in her kitchen listening to the sounds of her own house settle around her in the quiet. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged that neither of them named because naming it would have required acknowledging what it was, and both of them were people who had learned to be careful with things that mattered. He came twice more in November. Once to ask if she had any surplus chicken wire he could buy, because part of his coop fencing had gone down in a wind, and he was managing livestock by himself now. She sold him the wire and spent an hour helping him carry it to his wagon, and they ended up in her kitchen again drinking coffee and talking until the light changed. The second time he brought her a piece of venison from a deer he had taken on his north pasture, wrapped in paper, presented with the kind of careful nonchalance that meant it was not nonchalant at all. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I had more than I could use," he said, which was probably true and also not the whole truth, and they both understood this. She cooked the venison that evening in a stew with root vegetables, and thought about him eating alone at his cleared but still too large table, and felt the particular ache of a woman who is falling in love with someone who is still inside his grief, and who has enough respect for that grief not to rush anything. In December, the weather turned seriously cold, and the town of Caldwell went into its winter rhythms, the rhythms of 1882 on the southern Kansas border, which meant wood stacking and cattle tending, and the particular social geography of church and the general store as the primary places people encountered one another. Maude saw Dexter on Sundays at the Methodist Church on Main Street, where he sat in the same pew he had sat in with Clara for 15 years, and stared at the hymnal with the expression of a man who was present physically and somewhere else entirely in every other sense. She did not sit near him. It was too soon and too public, and she had no interest in becoming the subject of the kind of speculation that Caldwell's more industrious gossips would immediately manufacture from proximity. But she was aware of him in the way you are aware of a particular weight in a room, a gravity that pulls without demanding anything. After the second Sunday in December, walking out into the cold morning air with the congregation dispersing around her, she felt a hand at her elbow and turned. He was standing close enough that she could see the breath coming from him in small clouds. "Would you have dinner with me?" he said. Then immediately, "At your house, I mean. Not I wasn't suggesting a restaurant," she said, and she let a small smile through. "I know, the Lone Star Cafe, yes," he blinked. "Yes, yes," Maude said. "Thursday." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been braced for a longer negotiation and is slightly disoriented by the absence of it. "Thursday," he said. It was not the Lone Star Cafe's finest evening from a culinary standpoint. The beef was tough, and the biscuits had been sitting since morning, but neither of them was eating for the food. They sat across from each other in the back corner that Maude chose deliberately, with enough distance from the other tables that their conversation belonged only to them, and he talked more freely than she had yet heard him talk, as though the formal setting had paradoxically made him less formal. He told her about Kentucky. Really told her this time, not the outline but the interior. The small tobacco farm, the father who hit first and thought second, the older brother who had left for St. Louis at 17 and written back exactly twice. The war, which he had been too young to fight in but old enough to watch destroy most of the men he had grown up around, leaving behind either corpses or men who came home and weren't quite themselves anymore. The decision at 22 to go west, which had felt less like optimism and more like the only direction that still had air in it. "You built something real," Maude said. "The ranch." "Clara and I built it," he said. He paused. "I keep saying things like that. I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said firmly. "She was your wife for 15 years. You are supposed to say things like that. I would think less of you if you didn't." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he used when she had said something that reorganized a piece of his thinking. "You're not," he started. "Not what? Bothered by it, the way most people get, like I'm supposed to be finished with it." "You're not finished with it," Maude said. "You won't be finished with it for a long time and maybe not entirely ever. That's not something to apologize for." He was quiet for a moment. "Most women," he began and then stopped, and she could see him deciding whether to continue. "Most women in this situation would want me to pretend you hadn't had a life before them," Maude said. "I'm not most women. And I wouldn't want a man who could put 15 years away like a coat he'd outgrown. That's not character. That's indifference." He sat with this. The lamp on the table between them cast everything in amber and shadow, and she thought he looked less ravaged than he had in November. Still carrying the grief, yes, always yes, but carrying it differently now, more like something he was learning to integrate rather than something that was swallowing him whole. "I need to ask you something," he said, and his voice dropped in the particular way that signaled something serious. "Ask," she said. "What is this?" He gestured between them in the small, economical way of a man who does not use gestures casually. "I need to know what you think this is." She looked at him for a moment. In the lamplight, with the sound of the cafe around them and the cold pressing at the windows, she considered giving him the carefully qualified answer, the one with enough distance built into it to protect herself if she was wrong about what she felt. She decided she was done with protection of that particular kind. "I think this is two people who have found each other at a complicated time," she said. "I think I look forward to seeing you more than I've looked forward to seeing anyone in a long time. I think I understand you better than I expected to, and I like what I understand. And I think whatever it is, it's something I would like to keep doing carefully and honestly and without rushing anything either of us isn't ready for." He held her gaze. His throat moved. "Maude," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like something he had been practicing getting right. "Yes," she said. "I haven't felt anything like this since." He stopped again. "I know," she said quietly. "Is that all right?" He asked, and she understood the question was not simple. He was asking whether she could hold the complexity of being the person who came after, whether she could receive what he had to offer while understanding that it existed in a life that had been fully and lovingly occupied before her. "It's all right," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just for a moment, just briefly, and then withdrew it as though remembering where they were, and she felt the absence of the warmth so acutely she almost laughed at herself. They walked out into the December cold together, and he helped her up into her wagon in the old-fashioned, courteous manner of a man who had been raised to do it and had never stopped, and he stood in the road watching her drive away, and she made herself look forward rather than back, though it required more self-discipline than she was entirely proud of. Sheriff Dale Prout had been watching. She had not thought about Prout since the road conversation in November, which had been a miscalculation. Prout was a man who viewed Caldwell as a territory he administered, including the social arrangements of its residents, and he had a specific and long-standing opinion about Maude Walker that he had expressed twice in the form of a proposal she had declined, once in the spring of 1881 and once in the summer of 1882. The second refusal had been delivered with more directness than the first because he had not taken the first one seriously enough, and she had been aware since then of a quality in his attention toward her that was less the attention of a man who had accepted a rejection, and more the attention of a man collecting evidence against a verdict he intended to overturn. She would have been less concerned about this if Prout did not also have a complicated relationship with the Keene property. It emerged slowly over December, through the pieces she assembled from conversations at the general store, and with Mrs. Harmon, that Prout had made an offer on 2 of Dexter's East pasture acres in the summer, which Clara had been very ill by then, and Dexter had declined. Prout had made the offer again in October, 2 weeks before Clara died, at a price that was notably below what the land was worth. Dexter had declined again. He came by the day after the funeral, Dexter told her one afternoon in January when she pressed gently on the subject, sensing that there was something there he had not said. Asked again, said the grief might make it hard for me to manage alone and that he was doing me a kindness by offering a fair price. His expression tightened. "It wasn't a fair price." "Did you tell him that?" "I told him to get off my property," Dexter said. "He didn't love hearing that." Maude filed this information beside the road encounter and the Sunday observations, and built from it a picture she did not particularly like. Prout was a man with a motive and a grudge and a badge, which was a combination she had seen do damage before. "Be careful with him," she told Dexter. He looked at her with the small frown he used when he was processing something. "I've been careful with him for months," he said. "He's the sheriff. Carefully is the only way I can be." "I mean more careful than that," she said. "I declined his proposals twice. He doesn't know how to take no for what it is." Dexter went very still. Something moved across his face that was new, something focused and controlled and dark at the edges in the way of a man who has just been told about a specific kind of threat and is calculating how serious it is. "He proposed to you," he said. "Twice," she said. "The last time I was quite clear, he was not pleased. And now he knows you and I are." He caught himself. "Yes," Maude said. "I see," he said, two quiet words carrying a great deal of weight. January deepened the relationship in the way that cold weather deepens relationships in frontier towns, by forcing proximity and practicality and the revelation of character that comes from managing hardship alongside another person. He helped her repair the east wall of her chicken coop when a heavy snow brought part of it down, and she watched him work with the absorbed efficiency of a man who had been solving physical problems with his hands for 30 years. She brought him broth and cornbread when he came down with a chest cold in the second week of the month that left him hoarse and unable to manage the full workload of the ranch alone. She spent 3 days at the Keene house during that illness, which the town noted and which she refused to be embarrassed about. She was there because he needed help, because he was a man alone with sick cattle to tend and a body that was trying to pull him sideways, and because she was a practical woman who understood that caring about someone meant showing up when it was inconvenient and unglamorous. She slept on his sitting room settee and woke before dawn to stoke the fire and check on the horses and make sure the water trough had not frozen solid. He protested the first day and accepted the help by the second with a quiet and slightly wondering gratitude that she found more moving than any declaration. On the third evening, he was well enough to sit up properly and eat at the table, and they sat across from each other in the yellow light of his kitchen and talked until 10 o'clock, which was late by Kansas ranch standards. He told her about a recurring dream he had been having in which the house was empty, but not in the way a house is empty when no one is home. Empty in the way a house is empty when something essential about it is gone, when the principle of its warmth has departed, and he woke from it every time with a specific and terrifying loneliness. "The dream sounds different than it did at first," he said carefully. "It used to feel like pure loss. Now sometimes there's someone else in it, someone I can't quite see clearly." Maude looked at her cup. "I think my mind is trying to tell me something," he said. "What do you think it's telling you?" she asked. He looked at her directly. In the weeks of January, she had seen him become incrementally more capable of this, of sustained, direct looking, of allowing himself to be seen in the process of feeling something. "That this house doesn't have to stay empty," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. "Dexter," she said, "I'm not asking you anything tonight," he said quickly. "I'm not saying anything that requires an answer tonight. I just wanted to say it. Because I've been not saying things my whole life and I think I'm done with that." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest felt large and warm and slightly precarious. "Okay," she said. "Good, keep not saying things." He almost smiled. "You can't sentence like that." "I can sentence however I like," she said. "It's my language too." This time the almost smile became an actual one, and she sat with the enormity of how much she liked his smile, which she had seen perhaps 7 times in 3 months, and which she had apparently been cataloging with the devotion of a naturalist documenting a rare species. The trouble with Prout came in February, as she had privately expected it would. It came in the form of a conversation he engineered at the post office, the kind of conversation that is shaped like friendliness but carries the bone structure of a warning. He mentioned that he had been hearing things, the way people heard things in small towns, about Maude's visits to the Keene property, that he was concerned as a public official and as someone who had known her for 2 years about her reputation. That a widow man and an unmarried woman spending significant time alone was the kind of thing that could turn opinion in a town, and that opinion in a town had consequences. "Are you threatening me?" Maude asked, because she had decided long ago that pretending not to understand subtext was a luxury she could not afford. Prout looked offended in the theatrical manner of a man who had expected a different response. "I'm advising you," he said, "for your own good." "My own good is my business," Maude said. Not yours, and I'll thank you to keep it that way." She went directly from the post office to the Keene ranch and told Dexter what had happened. He listened with the focused stillness that was his mode of processing important information, and when she had finished he said, "I'm going to talk to him." "That may make it worse," Maude said. "Maybe," he said. "But I won't have him using your name to get at me, which is what this is. He doesn't care about your reputation. He cares about the East pasture and about you declining to marry him, and he's trying to move you by working through me." "Or he's trying to move you by working through me," Maude said. Dexter was quiet for a moment. "Both," he said. "That's the kind of man he is." "What are you going to do?" she asked. He stood up from the table with a deliberateness that reminded her of what he must have looked like at his strongest, before the grief and the winter had pulled him thin. "I'm going to go talk to Marcus Webb," he said. "He's running against Prout in the spring election." "You think Webb would?" "Marcus has been wanting leverage on Prout for 2 years, Dexter said. "I know things about Prout's handling of the Dahlin property dispute last summer that Prout doesn't know I know. I kept quiet because it wasn't my fight. Now it is." Maude looked at him. There was something clarifying about watching a man move from passive suffering to deliberate action, something that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with reclaiming his own ground. "Be careful," she said. "Always," he said, and then as she rose to leave, "Maude," she looked at him. "I'm glad you came and told me instead of handling it alone," he said. She considered this. She had, in fact, spent the entire walk from the post office to his ranch debating whether to mention it at all. The habit of handling things alone was deep in her. "I'm glad I did too," she said. She walked home in the cold February afternoon thinking about the word glad and how insufficient it was for what she actually felt, which was that something was being built between them, something with dimensions and weight, and the specific structural integrity of two people who had chosen each other rather than settled for each other. The conversation between Dexter and Marcus Webb had whatever effect it had. Maude was not privy to the details and did not push to be. What she observed was that Prout, in the following weeks, stopped engineering encounters with her, stopped positioning himself in doorways and street corners with his particular territorial ownership, and began to have the look of a man who was managing a quiet retreat. By March, he was notably less present in her vicinity, and by the time the spring election happened in April, Marcus Webb won the sheriff's race by 11 votes, and Prout packed his personal effects from the office on Main Street with the compressed fury of a man who knows he has been outmaneuvered and cannot prove it. Caldwell exhaled. Maude stood in her kitchen on the morning after the election results were announced and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the absence of a specific kind of watching. The sense that someone had their thumb on the scale of her life without her permission. It was gone now, or at least significantly diminished, and the air felt different in its absence. That afternoon Dexter rode up to her house and knocked on her door, and when she opened it, he was standing on her porch in the spring light, which was the light she liked best in Kansas, pale gold and immense, the kind of light that made everything look like it was in the first chapter of its own story. "Prout's gone," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to come and say it in person," he said. "And I wanted to ask you something." She looked at him. The rawness she had first seen on this same porch in November was still there, but transformed now, the way scar tissue transforms from wound to strength over time. He was not the same man he had been in November. Neither was she entirely. "Ask," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small wooden box, the kind you could buy at the dry goods store that was meant for hairpins or buttons or small jewelry. He opened it, and inside was a gold ring, simple and narrow, slightly worn, clearly old. "This was my mother's," he said, "not Clara's. I want you to understand that. This is my mother's ring from Kentucky. I've carried it for 30 years. Maude looked at the ring and then at him. "I am aware," he said, with the careful precision of a man who has been thinking about the exact words for a long time, "that this is not the most elegant proposal in the history of Kansas. I am aware that I am a man who is still grieving, who has a ranch that needs work, who talks too little at the wrong times and too much at the wrong other times. I am aware that you have refused other men, and I am aware that I am not doing this perfectly." "Dexter," she said. "I'm aware of all of that," he said. "And I'm asking anyway, because I think we understand each other in a way that I didn't expect to find again. Because you left bread on my porch when I had nothing left, and you didn't ask for anything in return, and then you let me knock on your door and you gave me coffee, and you walked along the creek with me, and you slept on my settee when I was sick, and you told Prout to mind his own business, and you have been the most consistently honest and kind and genuinely strong person I have been around in a very long time." He paused. "I would like to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve all of that." She stood in the doorway of her house in the April light with her hands at her sides and felt tears arrive without warning, which annoyed her slightly and moved her completely. "Yes," she said. His breath left him in a long exhale. "Yes," he repeated, as though confirming the word meant what he thought it meant. "Yes," she said again. "Please, I would like that very much." He stepped forward and put the ring on her finger with careful hands, and then stood very close to her, close enough that she could see the exact quality of his relief, which was not the relief of conquest but the relief of arrival, of a man who had made a crossing he was not certain he could make, and had found solid ground on the other side. She put her hand against his face, just once, just briefly, in the way you touch something you want to understand with more than your eyes. He covered her hand with his. They stood that way for a moment in the doorway, in the spring air, in the unceremonious and entirely adequate perfection of it. They were married on a Saturday in June of 1883, in the Methodist Church on Main Street, on a morning when the Kansas sky was so blue it looked painted. The new Sheriff Marcus Webb was there, and Mrs. Opal Harmon, who had watched the whole arc of them from her porch with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had seen it coming since November, and the Greer family from 2 miles south who had been Dexter's nearest neighbors since 1870, and Maude's sister Ada, who came all the way from Wichita on the stage and spent 2 days before the wedding holding Maude's hands at unexpected moments and looking at her with enormous and slightly worried love. "You're sure?" Ada said the night before, not because she doubted Dexter but because she was a good sister and good sisters ask. "More sure than I have been about anything," Maude said. "He's quiet," Ada said. "He's thoughtful," Maude said. "There's a difference." Ada looked at her for a long moment and then nodded. "He looks at you," she said. "I mean, he really looks at you, like you're the explanation for something he's been puzzling over." "That's how it feels from this side too," Maude said. They stood at the front of the church in their best clothes, and Maude said her vows in a clear voice that did not shake, and Dexter said his in the low, careful tone of a man treating language with the respect it deserved. And when Reverend Mitchell pronounced them married, and Dexter kissed her, it was brief and formal in the public way of the time, but his hand on her face was not formal at all, and she understood exactly where she was and who she was with and felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely arrived. The reception was held in the church hall, which the women of the congregation had decorated with early summer wildflowers, and which Ada had commandeered the kitchen of for 2 days prior. There was dancing, which Maude had not expected because she had not thought of Dexter as a man who danced, and she found that he danced in the same way he did most things, with quiet attention and a preference for doing it right over doing it showily. They danced 2 waltzes, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder on the second one, and felt him hold her slightly closer in response. Mrs. Harmon watched from her chair near the wall with an expression of complete vindication. They rode out to the Keene ranch as husband and wife in the long summer evening, the wagon loaded with wedding gifts and Ada's contributions to the pantry, and a new curtain that one of the church women had made as a present for the kitchen window. And when they pulled up in front of the house, Dexter sat for a moment looking at it in the golden evening light. "It looks different," he said. "Different how?" Maude asked. He thought about this. "Like it knows," he said. And she decided she loved him completely and without reservation, which was a decision she had been making incrementally for 7 months, and which was now entirely made. The first year of their marriage was the year Maude came to understand the full dimensions of him, the way you can only understand the full dimensions of a person when you live alongside them in all weather and all mood. She learned that he woke before dawn every day without difficulty, and that his first act was to stand at the kitchen window with his first cup of coffee and look at the sky, not in any mystical sense, but in the entirely practical sense of a man reading the weather to plan his day. She learned that he was a meticulous accountant of the ranch's finances, keeping records in a neat hand in a ledger he had maintained since 1870, and that the ranch was in better condition than his apparent poverty and grief had suggested. He had simply stopped spending on anything non-essential in the months of Clara's illness, and then in the depths of his grief, and what had looked like penury was actually a kind of accumulated careful management. She learned that he was not naturally demonstrative in the public sense, but that privately, in the way he handed her coffee in the morning with the handle turned toward her already, in the way he always knew where she had set down her book and would put it back without comment on the side table, in the way he said her name when he came in from the barn, Maude, in a tone that was both ordinary and not ordinary at all. He was in fact thoroughly and specifically attentive to her in every way that mattered. She learned that the locked box of feelings his late wife had described was not locked anymore, or rather was locked in a different way, not sealed but contained, held carefully rather than suppressed, and that he had more interior depth than even 2 years of knowing him had fully suggested. He was reading more now, books she ordered from a catalog in Chicago, and they had a habit on winter evenings of reading opposite each other at the kitchen table, and occasionally reading a passage aloud if it struck them, a domestic practice of such quiet joy that she sometimes stopped mid-page just to be aware of it. He learned her. She could see him learning her, in the manner of someone who takes the process seriously and does not rush it. He learned that she had a temper that ran deep rather than hot, that she was not quick to anger, but that, when she was genuinely angry, she went very quiet in a particular way that was more alarming than shouting. He learned that she was more vulnerable about her intelligence than about anything else, that the years of being underestimated had left a specific kind of scar, and he began making small and consistent efforts to consult her on ranch decisions in the transparent and slightly touching way of a man who wants to demonstrate that he values a thing. He learned that she had her own grief, not the acute sharp grief of his experience but the long slow grief of a life that had not gone as planned, of years spent building something real alone and wondering if the aloneness was permanent. He told her once, in February of their first year, that he thought about the bread. She was at the stove and she turned around. "You think about it?" "Sometimes," he said. "I think about what would have happened if I hadn't gone to find out who left it, if I'd let it go." "What do you think would have happened?" she asked. "I'd still be sitting at that table in the dark," he said. "I think I'd have stayed there a long time, maybe a very long time." She came away from the stove and sat down across from him at the table. "I almost didn't leave it," she said. "I stood at the bottom of your porch steps for 3 minutes deciding." He looked at her. "What decided it?" "The light inside," she said. "At 4 in the morning, I thought no one should be sitting alone in a lit house at 4 in the morning and there should at least be bread." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Maude." "Yes. I'm glad you believe in bread," he said. She laughed, which was a sound he told her once was the best sound in the house, and he reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat that way in the February morning with the fire going and the ranch quiet around them and their lives, improbably and wonderfully, exactly where they were supposed to be. In the spring of 1884, Maude confirmed what she had suspected for 6 weeks, which was that she was expecting a child. She told Dexter on a Sunday morning before church, sitting on the porch steps in the early light, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that happened too quickly to fully catalog, but that included something she recognized as a specific and private terror, the terror of a man who had wanted something and was now in possession of the wanting's object and had simultaneously realized the magnitude of what he could lose. She took his hand. "Say something," she said. He stopped. "I am trying to find the right words." "Take your time," she said. He said, and stopped again, and she could see him assembling it carefully. "I am more grateful for you than I have words for. I have been more grateful for you than I have words for since November of 1882, and I thought by now I might have found the words, but apparently I have not. And now there is this, and I have even fewer words. And I want you to know that whatever words I don't have are not because I don't feel it. I feel it considerably." Maude pressed her lips together because she was very close to crying, and she preferred to finish the conversation first. "That," she said, "was perfectly said." He looked at her. "Are you all right? Are you feeling—" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm very well, actually. I feel well." He moved closer on the step and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they sat looking out at the morning, at the ranch they had built together over the past year and a half, at the land that was theirs now in every sense. And she thought about the particular mathematics of how a life gets made, how one act of basic human kindness, bred on a porch in the dark, can turn on a hinge and become this. The child arrived in November of 1884, just under 2 years from the morning she had left the bread on his steps, and it was a boy. They named him James, after Maude's father, who had been a good man and was no longer living, and after no one specific on Dexter's side, because Dexter wanted the boy to have a name that was entirely his own rather than carrying the weight of a complicated ancestry. James Keene came into the world on a cold night when the first real snow of the season was coming down outside the bedroom window, and Dexter sat in the chair by the bed through the whole of it, which was the whole of a long night, holding Maude's hand with a steadiness that she noted even in the midst of everything, and that she would remember later as one of the truest things about him, that when it mattered he was simply there, and he did not flinch. When the baby was clean and bundled and placed in Maude's arms, and she looked up and found Dexter looking at both of them with an expression she could not fully describe except to say that it was the expression of a man who has been given back something he had not expected to receive, she said, "Come here." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who had a startling quantity of dark hair and who was conducting a very serious examination of the middle distance. "He looks deliberate," Dexter said, "like he's already thinking about something." "He gets that from you," Maude said. Dexter looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "I mean that in a way that includes everything. Not just tonight, everything." She put her head against his shoulder because she was tired and he was there, and because after 2 years she still found that being near him had the quality of something she had been searching for without being certain of the shape of it. "You're welcome," she said, "for everything." James grew. He grew at the rate that healthy Kansas babies grew in the mid-1880s, which was to say with apparent enthusiasm for the project. And he had his father's dark hair and his mother's direct gaze, and what appeared to be a constitutional inability to be in any room without investigating every corner of it. Dexter, who had expected to be good at the abstract idea of fatherhood and somewhat uncertain about the physical reality of an infant, turned out to be naturally competent at the specific practical aspects of it in the way that competent practical men often are: the holding, the walking at 2 in the morning, the patient interpretation of what various configurations of distress required. He also turned out to be a man who talked to the baby. Maude would find him in the barn with James in the crook of his arm, explaining the function of various tools with the same careful thoroughness he brought to everything, or in the field with James tucked against his chest in the way that Ada had shown them, pointing out the horses and the sky and the specific clouds with the names he knew for them, the ones he had learned from an old almanac and used to navigate weather. Mrs. Harmon, who visited regularly and who had adopted the position of surrogate grandmother with a completeness that no one had thought to argue with, told Maude one afternoon while they were shelling beans on the porch that she had been watching the Keene ranch for 30 years and that this was the best she had seen it look. "The land or the people?" Maude asked. "Both," Mrs. Harmon said. "Same thing out here." The second child came in the fall of 1886, a girl this time, and they named her Clara. There had been a conversation about this, which Maude had initiated herself, which was something she had thought about carefully over the preceding months. She had brought it up on an autumn evening when James was asleep and they were sitting by the fire, and she had said simply that if the child was a girl she would like to name her Clara, if Dexter was comfortable with that. He had been very still for a moment. "You'd want that," he said. "She was a good woman," Maude said. "She was your wife for 15 years, and she's part of why you are who you are, and I'm not interested in pretending that history doesn't exist. I think honoring it is better than erasing it. And I think a daughter named Clara is a good thing to have." He had looked at her for a long time, and she had held his gaze in the way she always did, steadily and without pretense, and he had said, "Maude Walker Keene, you are the most remarkable person I have ever known." "Keene," she had said. "Just Keene now." "Maude Keene," he had said. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known." "I know," she had said, and he had laughed, and they had sat by the fire until the logs burned down. So the second child was Clara Keene, born in October of 1886 with her mother's fair coloring, and a disposition that announced itself immediately as one that would require negotiation. She was a child who had opinions. She communicated these opinions at volume from the earliest age, which Dexter regarded with a mixture of exhaustion and deep private admiration, and which Maude regarded with the recognition of a woman who had spent 30 years being told her opinions were excessive. "She's going to be a handful," he said one evening, watching Clara, now 6 months, express her thoughts about the discontinuation of supper. "Good," Maude said. "The world needs more women with handfuls in them." James, who was 2 by then, and had reached the stage of understanding that his small sister was a permanent feature of the household, regarded her with the thoughtful seriousness that was already his characteristic mode of engaging with complexity. He did not love her immediately in the sentimental storybook sense, but he watched her carefully and occasionally touched her head with one deliberate finger, which Dexter told Maude was exactly what James did when he encountered anything he intended to take care of. The ranch grew in those years. Not extravagantly, because extravagance had never been the point, but solidly, and with the kind of steady expansion that reflects good management and 2 people working in genuine partnership. They brought on a ranch hand named Tobias Frey in 1885, a quiet man from Iowa in his late 30s who asked sensible questions, worked without complaint, and had the decency not to interfere in the life of the house. He had a small room in the bunkhouse behind the barn and ate supper with them 3 evenings a week, which became a regular and comfortable arrangement. He treated Maude with the straightforward respect of a man who recognized competence when he saw it, which she appreciated immensely. They expanded the cattle herd. They replanted the east field with winter wheat in a rotation that Maude had read about in an agricultural journal, and which turned out to work considerably better than the previous approach. They built a new chicken coop, a proper one this time, large enough for 60 birds and with a floor that actually kept the predators out. They repaired the house roof, which had been a problem Dexter had been managing around for years, and replaced the kitchen window, and Maude put in a proper kitchen garden along the south wall of the house that by summer of 1886 was producing enough that they were trading surplus at the general store. All of this was ordinary. All of this was the ordinary accumulation of a life built well by 2 people who had found each other at the right moment, and then chosen each other every day after. Maude thought about ordinariness sometimes, about how she had spent years understanding it as a kind of lesser category, as the consolation prize for lives that had not achieved something grander, and how entirely she had been wrong about that. Ordinariness, when it was made well and chosen deliberately, was not lesser than anything. It was the whole project. In the summer of 1887, she was in the kitchen when Dexter came in from the barn on a July morning with the kind of expression she had learned to read as something has happened that I am still processing. He sat down at the table without speaking for a moment, and she set 2 cups of coffee down and waited. "Pruitt's back in town," he said, passing through apparently. "He was at the hotel on Main Street this morning. Mrs. Harmon saw him." Maude sat down. "Passing through to where?" "Colorado, they're saying. He's got some mining interests." Dexter wrapped his hands around his cup. "He came past the property this morning, just rode past, didn't stop." "Did he see you?" "Yes," Dexter said. They were quiet for a moment. "What did he look like?" Maude asked. Dexter thought about this. "Old," he said. "Tired, like a man who made decisions 5 years ago that he's still paying on." Maude considered this. The fear she had once had of Pruitt was something she had folded carefully and put away somewhere she rarely accessed, not because she had forgotten it, but because it had lost its urgency, which was what happened to most fears when you built a life sturdy enough that small men with grievances no longer had purchase on it. "Good," she said simply, and drank her coffee, and they moved on. He did not stop. He passed through Caldwell and kept going, and she never saw him again. The town said he ended up somewhere in the San Juan Mountains, with a stake in a silver claim that may or may not have amounted to anything. She did not spend much time thinking about it. James Keene began school in the fall of 1889, at the one-room schoolhouse on the north edge of town that a young teacher named Miss Holt from Ohio ran with a firmness and intelligence that Maude admired considerably. He was 5 years old and took to reading with the focused absorption of a child for whom it had always been the obvious activity, and he came home from his first week with the expression of a person who has discovered that the world is significantly larger than they had previously understood, and who regards this as good news. Clara Keene went everywhere that James went, insofar as she was able to, and created significant logistical complications in every environment. She was 3 and was not yet old enough for school, but had firm opinions about this injustice, which she expressed to Dexter one evening in terms that were impressively coherent for someone who still regularly referred to the barn cat as the soft gray man. "She's going to be a lawyer," Dexter told Maude that night quietly, with the fond exasperation that Clara inspired in him routinely. "Or a senator," Maude said. "Women aren't senators," Dexter said. "Not in 1889, Maude said. "Give it time." He looked at her with the expression she particularly loved, the one that was thinking and considering and reaching a slightly different place than where he had started. "I hope you're right," he said. "I'm usually right," she said. "You're usually right," he agreed. They were sitting on the porch on a September evening when she said this, with the last of the summer in the air, and the cottonwoods showing the first yellow edges of fall. And James was chasing the barn cat around the yard with no particular goal in mind. And Clara was on the porch step, very seriously telling the story of her day to the wooden doll Ada had sent from Wichita. And Dexter had his arm around Maude and was telling her something about a possible trade with the Greer Ranch for an additional bull next spring. And she thought she had never been so entirely where she wanted to be. She put her hand over his on her shoulder. He stopped talking about the bull. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, "just paying attention." He pressed his lips to her hair, which was the kind of ordinary affection that had become so habitual between them that she suspected she would never fully take it for granted, because it was the kind of thing that had not been guaranteed, that had come from a specific act of bread baking in the dark and a series of choices after that to keep choosing, to keep showing up, to keep being honest about what was real. "7 years ago you left bread on my porch," he said. She looked at him. "You counted." "November 1882, he said. "I count every year." She turned slightly to look at his face in the September evening light, at the gray now fully distributed through his dark hair, at the lines around his eyes that were the lines of a man who had weathered real things, at the particular quality of his gaze when it rested on her, which was still, after 7 years, the gaze of a man who was paying close attention because he found her worth paying attention to. "What do you think about when you count?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I think about how close it was," he said. "How easily I could have stayed inside that morning. How easily you could have talked yourself out of it on those porch steps." "I almost did," she said. I told you that. I know, he said. That's what I think about, the almost. The almost. She understood what he meant. The narrow passage that all real things have to pass through, the moment where they could go one way or the other, the contingency of happiness, the specificity of it, the way it required not just intention but the actual thing itself. Cold morning, warm bread, a woman on porch steps deciding. I'm glad I climbed them, she said. So am I, he said. Every day, so am I. James had caught the barn cat and was sitting in the yard holding it with concentrated care, while it expressed its opinions about this with considerable eloquence. And Clara had abandoned her doll and was now making her way to the yard with the determined locomotion that characterized everything she did. And the cottonwoods moved slightly in the evening air, and the Keene ranch lay around them in the long September light, solid and real and theirs. In the spring of 1890, Maude learned she was expecting again. She told Dexter at the kitchen table on a morning in April that was so warm it felt like summer arriving early, and his response was faster than it had been the first time, less terrified, more simply and immediately glad. He stood up from the table and held her, and she held him back, and they stood that way in the warm kitchen for a good long while without saying anything because everything had already been said and would be said again, and the saying of it was not the point. The point was this. The standing in the kitchen, the morning light. The two children who would hear the news that evening with different emotional vocabularies, James with his careful processing and Clara with her immediate and theatrical excitement. The ranch outside, the land that knew them now. The third child arrived in October of 1890, another boy, and they named him Benjamin after nobody in particular, but because it was a good name and felt like a beginning. Benjamin Keene came into the world on a morning when the autumn light was thin and gold, and he had his mother's coloring, and what appeared to be a disposition that was going to be comprehensively sunnier than either James's careful gravity or Clara's magnificent willfulness, which Maude told Dexter represented a successful diversity of personalities across their family. We have covered the range, Dexter said, looking at the baby who had just smiled at nothing in the way that new babies do and which was still entirely effective. The frontier is large, Maude said. We're keeping up with it. He laughed. She catalogued the laugh the way she always did, with the specific fondness of a woman who had first heard this man laugh in her kitchen in November of 1882 and had been glad of it every time since. Ada visited from Wichita in the summer of 1891 and spent 2 weeks at the Keene ranch and left, Maude thought, changed in a small but real way. Ada had never married, and she had arrived for this visit with the particular quality of braced serenity that unmarried women of the time often developed, the way of holding yourself that says, I have made peace with my choices and do not require your sympathy. Maude had never felt anything but respect for Ada's independence, which was genuine and hard-won. But she watched her sister over those 2 weeks and saw something soften in her, in the way that watching a good marriage, a real one, can soften the most defended positions about what is and is not possible. You too, Ada said on her last evening, sitting on the porch with Maude while Dexter read to James and Clara inside and Benjamin slept in the cradle he had essentially already outgrown. What about us? Maude said. You look at each other like you're still figuring each other out, Ada said. After 9 years. We are, Maude said. I think that's the point, you don't want to finish. Ada was quiet for a moment. I spent a lot of years thinking this kind of thing was luck, she said. The good kind you either got or you didn't. It's partially luck, Maude said, but it's also bred. Ada looked at her sideways. You're being cryptic. I'm being literal, Maude said. It started with bread, everything after was a choice. Ada considered this for a long time, looking out at the Kansas evening at the wide flat land going dark in the distance. I might write some letters, she said, when I get home. Write good ones, Maude said. Ada did eventually, write a good one to the right person, a widowed schoolteacher in Wichita named Robert Pierce. But that was a separate story and belonged to Ada and Robert, and not to these pages except as a footnote of general happiness. The year 1893 brought hard times to much of Kansas in the form of the broader economic panic that had been building in the country, the collapse of silver, the banking failures, the cascading difficulty of farm credit that left families who had been managing across the state suddenly not managing. The Keene Ranch felt it. They felt it in the price of cattle, which dropped significantly. They felt it in the cost of supplies, which did not drop correspondingly. They felt it in the quality of the winters, which had been brutal for 2 years running, and which had taken more cattle than they could comfortably absorb. Dexter and Maude sat at the kitchen table in January of 1893 with the ledger between them and talked about it plainly, the way they talked about everything, directly, with all the information on the table and no performance in either direction. "We can sell the North 40, Dexter said. "The Greers have offered before." "That's our buffer," Maude said. "If we sell the North 40 and we have another bad year, we're down to the core acreage and we can't expand back. What's the alternative?" "The cattle herd," she said. "We cull further than we planned. Take the loss now to reduce the carrying cost through winter. It's worse in the short term and better in the long term." He looked at the ledger. She looked at him. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said without triumph, because it was not a triumph. It was a difficult decision that needed to be made, and being right about difficult things was not a source of pleasure. They culled the herd and held the North 40, and by 1895 the market had recovered enough that they were back to the level they had been before the panic, and by 1896 they were slightly ahead of it. These were not dramatic victories. They were the ordinary victories of two people who had managed something hard by thinking clearly and acting decisively and trusting each other's judgment, which was also what all the other victories of their marriage had been, at different scales. Benjamin Keene turned 5 in the fall of 1895 and started school, and discovered within the first week that the world outside the ranch was considerably more complicated and interesting than his sunny disposition had prepared him for. Specifically, that other children were not automatically as well disposed toward one another as he was toward them. He came home from his second week looking slightly less universally confident than he had started. "People are more difficult than cows," he announced at supper. Dexter looked at Maude. Maude looked at Dexter. "Yes," Dexter said, "they are." "Why?" Benjamin asked. "Cows don't have choices," Maude said. "People do." Benjamin absorbed this with the expression of someone accepting a piece of information that he was going to spend a long time processing. "Oh," he said. James, who was 11 and had the advantage of several years of navigating other children, told his younger brother over the washing up that the key was to find the 2 or 3 people who were worth the trouble, and then simply be very loyal to them, and not worry about the rest, which was advice that was simultaneously more practical and more philosophically mature than most adults could have offered. Clara, who was 9 and had been navigating other people since birth with the competence of a natural diplomat who had simply decided not to moderate herself for anyone's convenience, said that she thought people were not more difficult than cows, but differently difficult, and that the thing about people was that some of them were worth it in a way cows weren't, which she felt was relevant information. Dexter told Maude that night, quietly, that he thought their children had turned out remarkably well. "They have good material to work from," Maude said. "From you," he said. "From both of us," she said firmly. He pulled her closer. "Both of us," he allowed. November of 1897 was 15 years from the morning she had baked the bread and walked 3 miles in the dark to leave it on the porch of a man she barely knew. James was 13 now, studying at the school with the focused intensity that Miss Holt, who had stayed in Caldwell longer than anyone had expected, and who had accumulated a generation of students she regarded with proprietary pride, said was the most comprehensive she had seen in 15 years of teaching. Clara was 11 and had recently decided that she wanted to study law when she was grown, which was not a realistic ambition for a girl in 1897, but which no one in the Keene household told her was unrealistic, because they were not that kind of household. Benjamin was 7 and had recovered his fundamental sunniness from the blow of early social complexity, and was at school regarded as the person most likely to make two arguing parties feel that their argument had been resolved satisfactorily to both of them. On the morning of the anniversary, Maude rose before Dexter and baked a loaf of bread. Not the plain, simple loaf she had baked in 1882, though there was something deliberate about its simplicity even then, but a good honey wheat bread that she had perfected over 15 years, and that was, she thought without false modesty, genuinely excellent. She wrapped it in muslin and tied it with twine. When Dexter came downstairs to the kitchen, he stopped in the doorway and saw it on the table and looked at her, and she saw in his face the layering of 15 years of mornings, of choices made and kept, of a grief that had been carried and transformed, of a love that had been built careful piece by piece in the cold Kansas dawn and the warm Kansas summer and all the weather in between. "You made bread," he said. "I make bread," she said. "It's a thing I do." He came to the table and sat and picked up the loaf in both hands the way he had picked up that first loaf on his porch, with a deliberateness that was not about the bread but about what the bread meant, about the weight of what small human kindness can become when it is received honestly and followed through. She sat across from him. 15 years, he said. 15 years, she agreed. "You know what I think about," he said. "The almost," she said. "The almost," he agreed. "And then the actual, everything that happened because you climbed those steps." He set the bread down. "I was in a dark place, Maude. I don't think I've ever said it that plainly. I was in a dark place and I wasn't coming out of it on my own. I was too far in and too stubborn about it." She looked at him across the table, this man she had come to know in every season and in every mood and in every variety of ordinary and extraordinary circumstance that 15 years could contain. He was still careful with his words. He still said them with the precision of someone who had learned late, and at some cost, that saying the real thing out loud was survivable. He was grayer now, and his hands showed the work they had done, and there were lines in his face that told the story of weather and grief and love and 3 children and years of early mornings. He was the most familiar person in the world to her, and she was still curious about him, still finding new things, still occasionally surprised by what came out of him when the conditions were right. "You would have come out of it," she said. "Eventually." "Maybe," he said. "But not in time to find this." He gestured between them, the same small economical gesture he had used at the Lone Star Cafe in December of 1882 when he had asked her what this was. "Bread is powerful," she said. "You're powerful," he said. She broke off a piece of the loaf and pushed it across the table to him. He took it. They sat in the kitchen in the November morning light, in the house that knew them now, in the life they had made together piece by piece from grief and kindness, and a series of choices made in the specific direction of each other, and they ate bread, and outside the Kansas morning went on doing what it did, the sky wide and cold and immense and theirs. James came down the stairs and looked at the two of them with the 13-year-old's particular mix of comprehension and embarrassment that means, "I understand exactly what this is, and I appreciate it, and I would like to not have to say so out loud." And he sat at the table and accepted his piece of bread from Maude with a nod that contained more meaning than most words. Clara came down behind him with her hair still loose and her opinions already fully formed for the day, and she said good morning to both her parents, and then she said to Maude, "You made the good bread, the honey kind." "Special occasion," Maude said. Clara looked between her parents with the sharp attention she brought to everything. "What occasion?" "The day I met your father," Maude said. Clara absorbed this. "I thought you met at church." "We met properly on November 15th, 1882, Maude said. "Your father came to my door." "Because you left him bread," James said without looking up from his piece. "Because I left him bread," Maude agreed. Clara looked at Dexter. "And then you married her," Clara said, the way children state large things as simple facts. "And then I married her," Dexter said. "Best thing I ever did." Benjamin thundered down the stairs, making the amount of noise achievable only by a 7-year-old fully committed to the experience of descending stairs. And he arrived in the kitchen in a condition of complete morning enthusiasm, saw the bread, and said, "Oh, excellent." They sat around the kitchen table, all 5 of them, in the November morning of 1897, in Caldwell, Kansas, in the house that had known grief and silence and loneliness, and had known since November of 1882 the incremental and enduring warmth of a woman who had climbed a porch in the dark with bread in her hands, because no one should sit alone in a lit house at 4 in the morning, and there should at least be bread. Maude looked at Dexter across the bread and the children and the table he had once sat at alone in the dark, and he looked back at her, and there was no word in any almanac or catalog or ledger or letter she had ever read that was adequate for what passed between them in that look. But there was bread, and there was this, and it was more than enough. It was everything.